Welcome to the beginning of year training of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act of 2008 for teachers and administrators. This training will provide you with a general overview of Section 504 for educational settings. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 came about as part of the Americans with Disabilities Act and IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It protects the rights of individuals with disabilities in any program or activity that receives federal money, in this case, the public school system. The focus of Section 504 is on non-discrimination. Just as in IDEA, Section 504 requires a school district to provide a free, appropriate public education to qualified students with disabilities, regardless of the nature or severity of the disability. Many times, these students are already being served under special education. Section 504 provides some of the same services as special education, but not to the same extent, because Section 504, though mandated by law, is not funded. It may be appropriate if a student's disability requires more accommodations or services that can be provided under 504 to consider special education for that student. Section 504 is all about leveling the playing field. It does not exist to provide an opportunity for students to have an advantage over their non-disabled peers, but rather to ensure that the student's educational needs are met as adequately as his or her non-disabled peers. Again, remember that Section 504 is in place to ensure non-discrimination. The law states that a student is eligible for Section 504 if he or she has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities, if he or she has a history of an impairment or is regarded as having an impairment. A doctor's medical diagnosis is not required to determine Section 504 eligibility. Any data that can be used to determine eligibility, including a doctor's diagnosis, is important and should be used. Section 504 law defines a major life activity as regulations to include functions such as caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, working, eating, sleeping, standing, lifting, bending, reading, concentrating, thinking, and communicating. The question often comes up, when should a student be referred for Section 504 evaluation? Many times, the referral is initiated by a parent, the school nurse, or the child's teacher. If the school suspects that a child might have a disability, it is their duty to begin the RTI process, which could lead to an evaluation for Section 504 eligibility. In some cases, these students may end up qualifying for special education. One single source of data might be enough to trigger the initial evaluation for Section 504 eligibility, but should not be used independently to determine eligibility. Other forms of data must be included for eligibility determination. This data may include, but is certainly not limited to, grades, attendance, test scores, behavior, classroom observation, discipline history, doctor's diagnosis, teacher input, and parent input. If a student is being evaluated for Section 504 eligibility, it is never one person's duty to evaluate and make such an important decision. To protect yourself and to work in the best interest of the child, this must be done by a committee of knowledgeable people. Within this committee, there should be representatives of persons who know about the child, person who understands the meaning of the evaluation data, and persons who understand the placement option. This committee would generally include the campus counselor, an administrator, and a teacher. Parents are not required by law to be part of the Section 504 committee, but it is considered best practice in HEB to invite them to attend and participate. Other campus staff, such as the school nurse, dyslexia specialist, or behavior interventionists, should be invited to participate as needed and as appropriate for the child. When determining if a student is eligible under Section 504, the committee must answer the following 3 questions. Number 1, does the student have a physical or mental impairment? If the answer is yes, even if the impairment is episodic, in remission, or in a mitigated state, the impairment for eligibility purposes should be recognized. You are not making a medical diagnosis. Question number 2. Does a physical or mental impairment affect one or more major life activities? And question 3. Does a physical or mental impairment substantially limit a major life activity as compared to the average student of the same grade or age? If the answer to all 3 of these questions is yes, then the student is considered to be eligible under Section 504. In the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act of 2008, you can read here that the definition of disability was opened up and became very broad, much broader in fact than in previous years. The door in to Section 504 got much wider in 2008. This means that you will very likely have more students than ever eligible under Section 504, but not all will require an accommodation plan. The child that is eligible with no need for an accommodation plan is termed technically eligible, and under modern Section 504 standards, eligibility is separated from the decision of whether the child needs services under Section 504. We will discuss this more in a later slide. Before the Amendments Act, a student was not eligible if there was no educational need. With the passing of the Amendments Act in 2008, that is no longer true. Educational need should not be an issue when determining eligibility. Eligibility for Section 504 stands alone and separate from the need for accommodations. Students who have health plans might need to be evaluated for eligibility under Section 504. The Office of Civil Rights has not taken the position that all students with health plans must be referred to 504, or that every health plan must be developed under 504 procedures. This allows schools some discretion when considering a possible 504 evaluation for a student with a health plan. There are factors to consider. Students with diabetes and asthma will generally always necessitate a need to evaluate for 504 eligibility. The school nurse should be a part of the committee meeting for students with these and other health-related disabilities that may require a separate health plan, such as food allergies. When considering the need to evaluate students with health plans and 504, the factors you should consider are the degree of severity of the health condition, the degree of complexity of the health plan, the risk of a medical emergency at school, the severity of potential consequences of a medical event at school, the frequency of implementation of the health plan, the need for accommodations and services in the classroom, the need of the health plan implementation in order to function in and attend school, and the student's classroom performance. As an example, consider 2 students with an allergy to bee stings. One student, if stung, experiences localized swelling, itching, and tenderness of the affected area, but nothing more. The other student, if stung, could begin to experience shortness of breath, swelling of the throat and tongue, severe itching, and requires use of an EpiPen. Which of these 2 students might need to be considered for 504? The second student, who has a much higher likelihood of experiencing potentially severe adverse reactions to the bee sting. Once eligibility is determined, it is the Section 504 Committee's decision to determine if an individual accommodation plan, or IAP, is necessary for the student. If it is not, then the student is technically eligible, but based on the decisions of the 504 Committee, does not need accommodations. The student is still protected under 504, but will not receive accommodations in the classroom. Some things the committee should consider when determining the need for an IAP are listed here. For instance, addressing the prospect that a student's needs may be so severe that a special education referral is appropriate. Another thing to consider is if the student's impairment is in remission and the student does not need accommodations. If so, an accommodation plan is not necessary. Another thing to keep in mind would be asking if the student's needs are being addressed by mitigating measures that do not require additional services. An example of this would be a student who wears glasses or contacts, and as long as the glasses or contacts are being worn, everything is fine. Or perhaps an inhaler if the child has asthma. If an accommodation plan is deemed appropriate by the Section 504 Committee, it is the committee's responsibility to develop an appropriate plan. This is not a single person's decision. This sometimes becomes an issue because a parent may insist on a laundry list of accommodations, or may come in with a signed letter from the child's doctor with a prescriptive list of accommodations. The committee, and only the committee, makes the decisions about accommodations based on the needs of the student in question. Curriculum should never be modified for a student who is eligible under Section 504. It is possible and likely that students receiving 504 accommodations are enrolled in advanced academic classes. There are never, I repeat, never, any form of exemptions for state-mandated testing for 504 students. 504 students may be eligible for testing accommodations, and campuses should refer to the TEA Star Accommodations Triangle for guidelines. When considering testing accommodations, the 504 Committee should always first consider the regular STAR test. If the committee determines that a modified version of the test is required for the student's disability, then the committee should complete the necessary documentation to show the basis for that decision. The general rule of thumb to remember is, if the student is not receiving the accommodation on a regular basis in the classroom, then it should not be considered as a testing accommodation. Students who are eligible for accommodations under Section 504 may apply for accommodations for the PSAT, SAT, AP, IB, and ACT exams. Students must submit a request to the testing company in order for accommodations to be approved. By law, students are required to be re-evaluated for Section 504 eligibility every 3 years. In HEB, we also conduct a yearly accommodation plan review for each child identified as Section 504. This ensures that the accommodations that are in place are appropriate, allows for adjustment if necessary, and keeps the committee apprised of the progress of the student. Even students who are technically eligible need to be re-evaluated in case the need for an accommodation plan arises. Sometimes current students being served under Section 504 will be tested and qualify to be served under special education. If this happens, the student is no longer eligible under Section 504, as a student cannot be served under 2 programs. This applies even to students who are in speech only. A student being served under Section 504 who is, because of discipline, going to be removed or placed in an alternative setting for 10 school days or longer will have a manifestation determination conducted by the 504 Committee. This could be a cumulative total over the course of several incidents, or might be a long-term placement for 10 or more consecutive days. At the time of the meeting, the committee should ask the following questions. Number 1. Was the conduct in question caused by or directly and substantially related to the student's disabilities? And number 2. Was the conduct in question the direct result of the school's failure to implement the student's 504 plan, if there was any such failure? A yes answer to either of these questions means that the behavior in question must be considered to be a manifestation of the student's disability. If this is the case, the student cannot be expelled or placed in AEP for more than 10 school days without parent agreement or special circumstances that involve drugs, weapons, or serious bodily injury. Being a 504 student does not guarantee that the student will pass a course. Many times, parents and students believe that being a 504 student means that they cannot fail a class. This is simply not the case. For 504 students who are in advanced academic classes, it is important to note that the curriculum for these courses cannot be modified as an accommodation. Other accommodations can be considered, such as extended time, but modifying content is not allowable. It may be necessary to consider removal from an advanced academics course if the student is not being successful, even with accommodations. Any complaint regarding Section 504 should be first addressed at the campus level. If not resolved, then the parent should be directed to follow district procedures for Section 504 complaints. Complaints, if not solved at the campus or district level, are dealt with by the Office of Civil Rights. The focus of any OCR complaint is to look to see if the correct process was followed in the 504 procedures. One thing that should never, ever be an issue is that the teacher did not provide the accommodations as listed in the student's accommodation plan. Providing accommodations to a 504 student is never optional. It is always a good idea for teachers to document in order to show that accommodations were provided. The more documentation that a teacher can provide to prove that accommodations were made, should this question ever come up, the better. Each campus has a designated Section 504 coordinator. The coordinator is responsible for gathering data, planning and conducting meetings, and maintaining all 504 paperwork for the student. The coordinator is also responsible for communicating student accommodation plans to the teacher and other campus personnel who need to know information about the student. 504 documents are kept in the student's cumulative folder, and accommodations are posted in the student information system. Campus 504 file audits are conducted each spring. If you have questions related to anything regarding this presentation or Section 504, please contact your Campus 504 coordinator or Carla Dockin, the District Section 504 coordinator, for assistance. Thank you. You will now take a short quiz about Section 504. Upon successful completion of the quiz, please print your certificate and turn it in to your designated campus person. Have a great school year.